Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. As many of you know, I've recently returned from a 10-day trip to Ireland, where we toured a good part of the country and saw many beautiful and historic sites. But during the first days of the trip, my traveling companions, my dear friends June and Cindy, friends since childhood, and I went on our own adventure back in time to discover the childhood home of my beloved grandmother, Kathleen Seymour Mahoney, or Mahoney as it is pronounced in Ireland. She grew up in a tiny Irish cottage in the village of Cloncully in County Laois in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. She was the 13th of 14 Seymour children, the children of Patrick Seymour and Mary Dooley Seymour. She would leave Ireland in 1913 at the age of 17 all by herself and set sail for America on the RMS Baltic, an ocean liner of the White Star Line that sailed between 1904 and 1932. She would never see her mother again. She returned to Ireland only once after World War I with her two oldest children to see her father before he died. She was sponsored by very distant relatives in New York State who employed her as a domestic servant until she met my grandfather, David Joseph Mahoney, or Mahoney, 12 years her senior. They married and had 6 children, my father, Robert Emmett, being the youngest. She would see her first son, Daniel, die at the age of 5 of diphtheria. Her second son, David, survived the diphtheria outbreak as a child and would go on to grow up to serve as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Force in World War II, where he would die in June of 1944 in the aftermath of the invasion of Normandy. My father was 15 at the time. Her remaining 4 children, Marie, Doris, Ruth, and my father, Robert, would grow to adulthood and to raise families of their own. And they produced 18 grandchildren for Kathleen and David Mahoney. Kathleen and David would sponsor several of Kathleen's siblings, at least 3 brothers and 1 sister, Patrick, John, George, and Mary Seymour, and 2 nieces, Rose and Mary Conroy, daughters of her sister Bridget, who had 14 children of her own. We set out for Dublin by train for the city of Portlaoise in County Laois, knowing only that this is the biggest city, or really a town, it's a big town, near where my grandmother grew up. This was a 40-minute train ride from Dublin. Once in Portlaoise, our plan was to see if we could enlist a taxi driver to take us into 2 tiny villages where I knew I had family roots. I wanted to visit Camross, where there are 2 churches, or rather, there's one modern church, St. Fergal's, and the ruins of my grandmother's church, St. Kevin's, and its surrounding cemetery. I knew that my great-grandparents were buried there, as well as several of my grandmother's siblings and other relatives. I had pictures of these sites from my cousin, David Mitchell, who had made this trip in 2009 with his grandparents, my aunt and uncle, Aunt Dot and Uncle Mitchell. David gave me pictures from both his visit and from Google Maps street views. There are no real streets in this region, but more like a complex system of dirt roads. I thought that if we could get to the churches first, we had a better chance of finding my grandmother's house from there. When we arrived by train in Portlaoise, I approached the first taxi driver I saw. I told him we were on an adventure, and his immediate response was, "I love it, hop in." This was our introduction to Patrick Durkin, who would become our driver and our guide for the rest of the day. Taxi drivers in Ireland are true ambassadors for the country. They know everything about the history of the places where they drive, recent, distant, and ancient. And they are all willing to share it with their riders. Pat was no exception. He entertained us all day with stories about the history of Ireland and his own personal story as well. But Pat was no ordinary tour guide. He was fully invested in my personal quest, and at times I felt as if he was even more determined to find my grandmother's house than I was. He had great ideas of how we would find what we were looking for, and he shut off his meter every time we stopped and got out to explore a site. And some of these stops were for over an hour at a time. We also had a few wrong turns on these dirt roads because there are no street signs and nothing that you could put into a GPS. Pat would get out and introduce us to whatever local person we had happened upon and explain what we were looking for, and then get a new set of directions. These were directions like making a sharp turn at the large bush, or knowing you'd gone too far if you saw a sign for fishing. Pat found the ruins of St. Kevin's Church and the adjoining cemetery with relative ease, relative at least compared to the next part of the journey to my grandmother's cottage. He shut off the meter and he joined us in our search for the graves of my great-grandparents. We broke off in different directions to search. While there were some recent graves in this old cemetery, many of the graves, no, really most of them, were very old, dating back to the 19th century or the early 20th century. I suddenly heard our driver, Pat, cry out, "Eureka!" And we all went running. He found the grave of my grandparents, my grandmother's parents, Patrick and Mary, also the grave of her brother Richard and his wife Elizabeth. The grave marker is in a bad state of disrepair, and it needs to be straightened out, and it needs a good cleaning. But I could still make out all of the names and the dates, and we were able to take many pictures, which I'm including in this video. I was not prepared for the emotional impact of finding this old grave of people who have been gone for well over 100 years. Nothing could have prepared me for the deep sense of connection that I would suddenly feel to these people and to this very ancient land. We continued to search the cemetery and the ruins of the old church, and we found many other relatives, siblings of my grandmother, their spouses, children, and in some cases, grandchildren. Driver Pat thought that we should knock on the door of the church rectory, but before we could do that, Father Brian Griffin came out to meet us. Having seen a taxi pull up, not a common occurrence in Camross, he came out to see what was going on. Pat and I explained my mission, and Father Brian said that there are many Seymours in this area still, and he invited us into his house to view the church records. Only in Ireland. I could not imagine anything like this happening anywhere near where I live here in the U.S. Father Brian invited us to sit in his living room, and he came out with baptismal records going back to the 19th century and confirmation records from around the turn of the century. Not only did we find my grandmother's baptismal records from 1895, but we also found those of many of her 13 brothers and sisters. And I also found that my grandmother, whom we knew as Kathleen, and many people in the family are named for her, was actually baptized Catherine Seymour. I am not sure of the story there, if she changed her name herself from Catherine to Kathleen, or if it was changed at Ellis Island when she arrived in 1913, but we only knew her as Kathleen. She did, however, give her second daughter, my Aunt Doris, my godmother, she gave her the middle name of Catherine. No doubt this was in recognition of her own birth name. Father Brian looked at the pictures that I had of my grandmother's home from my cousin David, and he said right away that he knew the house, that he had in fact recently attended a wake there. He gave us a new set of directions to navigate these country dirt roads, and off we went. We made more than one wrong turn, as the houses that you do see from the road all look very similar, small stone Irish cottages, really. In one case, a farmer came out to greet us, looked at my picture, and told us how to get to the house. He said he knew the Seymours and he knew the house. At our next wrong turn, I met a young man who told me that his granny was a Seymour too. I later figured out that his grandmother would have been the same generation as my father. His great-grandfather, also a Seymour, was a blacksmith and the older brother of my grandmother. He directed us next to the house that we were actually looking for. I knew it right away, even though it looks much like all of the other houses where we had stopped. It's a small stone Irish cottage surrounded by farm equipment and tractor tires. It has an even older stone storage structure attached to it. People with small children obviously live there. There was a friendly dog on the premises, but no one was home. And we know no one was home because our guide, Pat, not only knocked on the door, but he knocked on several windows as well. I cannot fathom how a family of 16, 2 adults and 14 children, once lived in this cottage. But having now visited other Irish homes on this tour, I know that some of these cottages are much more spacious on the inside than they look on the outside. Still, it is hard to imagine how they all lived together in that space. Pat then drove us back to the train station in Portlaoise, where we took our train back to Dublin. We exchanged phone numbers, and he sent me all of the pictures that he had taken of our day, and I sent him mine. I wrote to Pat the next day to thank him again for joining us, for really leading us on this profoundly moving adventure. I told him that I think that the Irish people are some of the warmest, friendliest, and most welcoming people anywhere in the world, and that he is the best of the best. I feel so proud to be descended from these people. He wrote back about the spiritual mystery of our day together with one meaningful connection after another. He said it was the best day of all his days as a taxi driver. It was one of the most meaningful days of my life, too. Some of the pictures of the day will follow now. I hope you get a sense of the significance of this day for me. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.